it's controlled by what metal you feed into the top port. The electrolyte solution that you pour into the cell, and the Dacron filter at the outlet port. Then by changing out the types of metal that you for this one is I'm going to melt up silver-plated silverware. I'm going to throw some extra pure copper in there to get the copper content up a little bit. You also can take any of your old anodes that may still have a little bit of silver on them and put those in the crucible too. Melt those down and get some of that silver back. And you can melt household electronics. Take that apart first. Now to that, I'm going to add about 100 grams of borax. So seeing as how it can cost you between $5 and $10 in gas to melt all of this metal, you might as well make your anodes worth your while. So I'm going to put some gold-plated items. Piece of jewelry, 14K, that I struggle always getting those tiny little, they're not diamonds, they're fake diamonds, and those will just get caught up in the borax. But this is 2.7 grams of 14K, so there should be over a gram of gold now in this melt. Put that in there as well. Figure as long as we're going through all this effort, keeping track, I'm going to put some gold in there and make it worth my while. original collar that I've used and I'm still using in my original cells here. All of the ones now that I sell online are hardwood red oak, but for this experiment, I'm testing a new solid oak collar. And the reason for this is twofold, actually. Number one, it secures in place the aspirator bottle more firmly. With this attachment, when I would take the bottle out, I mean, it does attach very firm and does hold the bottle well, but it would drop down and sit and wobble, and I couldn't use it as a way to kind of handle the whole system. This is more secure. This collar is it covers 2/3 of the opening, so it allows for evaporation, which is still an important part of this system. One of the main reasons I built the system was it's a way to deal with your solutions. The silver nitrate that's used in the silver cell, when it's completely saturated with other base metals, we take that solution out, pour in sulfuric acid, which liberates your nitric acid so you can distill that back. Turns the solution then into copper sulfate, which is used in the copper cells. So the silver cells, basically your leftover material, feeds the copper cell. In the copper cells, we can pull out those base metals and get our sulfuric acid back to run back in the silver cell. So back to the test that I wanted on here. I'm going to use copper sulfate that I've repurified back out of the system as my electrolyte. I'm going to XRF this anode bar so we can see exactly what's in it, and we're going to run it through the system. I'm not sure exactly how long it'll take, so I might make a couple of videos and just update you guys on the progress of what's happening with this cell. I poured 6 different bars in that melt and tested them all in the XRF. They were all relatively the same composition, and the winner is number 2. About 88% copper, 4.5% nickel, about 4% zinc, so equal parts nickel and zinc. Then we've got 2.15% silver, and a little iron and manganese, maybe a spring got mixed into the melt. So there should be about 1.2 grams of gold somewhere in these anode bars. But it's such a small amount of gold that it didn't show up on the XRF, which is something I really like about refining this older silver-plated items. I usually find gold in quite a bit of it. Now it's trace amounts of gold, but over a long run it does add up. Here's the last bit of gold I collected from the last anode bar. Remember that everything you melt into your anode bar does come out. Now let's go over the electrolyte solution that we use inside of the cells. The electrolyte that I use in silver cells 1 and 2 is silver nitrate solution. I'll put the recipe up on the screen. Dissolve pure silver crystals with dilute nitric acid using distilled water to make your electrolyte. The electrolyte in the copper cells is copper sulfate. This can be purchased as drain cleaner at the hardware store, and after about 3 to 4 months you can start to make all of your own copper sulfate and you won't have to buy hardly any. one last time. Copper cell. Alright, so now we're ready to start our experiment. We'll pour in the copper sulfate solution, about 2 liters. Then we'll add in our copper cathode. The reason for the silicone tube is where the solution meets the air, the electrical wire will want to oxidize. And you'll start to see green copper oxide form, which will contaminate your solution a little bit. And now we'll connect up our cathode to the negative terminal on the DC power supply. Next, we'll place in the anode bottle. Add some more copper sulfate solution. At this point, I'll add a little bit of solution right to the aspirator bottle. So my typical rule of thumb is I'll run it in the silver cell with silver nitrate solution if the alloy is 80% silver or more. If the alloy is 80% base metals and about 20% precious metals, then I'll run it in the copper cell. If the alloy is somewhere in between, I'll usually remelt that alloy bar and make it one of the first two options. So the number 1 and number 2 cells, silver nitrate and the electrolyte for number 3 and number 4 cells, copper sulfate, solved in water, fairly saturated. Now let's talk about what Dapper is using the first set of cells. The silver cell is not magnetic stainless steel. This is 304 grade stainless. Now in the copper cell, I use 12 gauge electrical copper wire. Here I've twisted 3 strands together to make the wire a little bit thicker. And you can see there's some strands that are kind of hanging off. Now you can get creative with whatever you use here. It'll just determine what type of crystals you'll form. I prefer to use the wire because I do remelt most of my copper. So what you'll end up with are kind of these nodules that form that can just be broken off and put into your melt. So we talked a little bit about how to recover your nitric acid, and if you'd like to learn more about that, you can watch that video here. That video also describes how to get your nickel and zinc removed from the system. It also talks about how to remove any lead from the system, and sometimes you'll even find a little bit of silver sulfate that'll get caught up in your lead sulfate. So let's go over how we get pure copper sulfate crystals from this system. After I run about 3 or 4 kilos of silver through the silver nitrate solution, we pour in the sulfuric acid, which liberates the nitric acid and is distilled off and captured so that that nitric acid can be reused. What's left in the reaction beaker during that distillation process is kind of this dirty copper sulfate crystals. Now, if you run at a very high temperature, you're going to degrade most of the nickel, tin, zinc, any of the other metals that are in there, and they'll kind of turn into a salt. And upon settling, they'll just crystallize out. The solution on top is your pure copper sulfate. This can be filtered off and recrystallized to form pure copper sulfate crystals. So the process of purifying your dirty copper sulfate is simply to dissolve it in water, allow the impurities to settle out, and then recrystallize your copper sulfate. Like a majority of the steps with this system, if you want anything totally pure, you'll want to run it through once, twice, maybe even 3 times to remove any of the impurities. So let's go ahead and dissolve this up so we can use it for our electrolyte. Since all of the parts are interchangeable and I don't need a number 1 silver cell right now, I'm going to use this equipment to mix up our copper sulfate and make another copper cell.
which he was otherwise a stranger, converted himself publicly to Judaism, discarded his real name, and took the name of Moses Germanus. He foolishly challenged Wachter to imitate him and engaged with him in a correspondence from which sprang a little book entitled Spinozism in Judaism. The book does not throw much light upon the nature or upon the origin of the Kabbalistic ideas, but it raises a question of the highest interest. Was Spinoza initiated in the Kabbalah, and what influence did this doctrine exert upon his system? Until then, it was the almost general opinion among scholars that there is quite a close affinity between the most important points of the science of the Kabbalists and the fundamental dogmas of the Christian religion. Wachter undertook to demonstrate that these two orders of ideas are separated by an abyss, for, in his opinion, the Kabbalah is nothing but atheism, the negation of God and the deification of the world, a doctrine which he believed to be that of the Dutch philosopher and to which Spinoza gave a more modern form. We need not investigate here whether the two systems per se are well or ill-judged, but whether there is some ground for the theory of their affinity or for their historical succession. The sole proof given consists of two very important passages. Indeed, one drawn from Ethics, the other from Spinoza's letters. The last named reads, "When I affirm that all things exist in God, and that in Him all things move, I speak like St. Paul, like all the philosophers of antiquity, although I express myself in a different way, and I even dare to add, like all the ancient Hebrews, as far as can be judged by certain of their traditions which have been altered in many ways." Evidently, nothing but the Kabbalistic traditions are referred to in these lines, for those which the Jews collected in the Talmud are...
So there really is a bunch of experiments that we can run now that we have all four of the cells set up. We're obviously going to get back our pure silver and copper metal. Also have videos on how to extract the nickel and zinc, how to remove the lead from the system, how to recycle your acid back into the system. So please go to my channel and check out some of those videos.
Transactional, like the warlords of factory floors, leave to those senses, you know what makes sense, right? Never pop away, baby, fully got the keys of flame, sell the pain, rip to your brain, never thought you'd get so Influenced out with no rider leaning on the chipset. A component part to get you started. So people, Marcy, Bossy, Gmail, turn the snail mail to Metro Mail. Highest special, the line is on the hotline. All the blueberries, Oh,
waxing up the coconut lube. Oh, waxing up the coconut
Closest approach.
organized properly. So once we have
Got a posse and a posse and a posse ride. Got a posse and a posse and a posse ride. That's right. Your ass is
1